Welcome to the Everyday Saint podcast, brought to you by Cedar Fort Publishing and Media. Here, we meet with authors who share their highlights of their latest book and the backstory behind its creation. I'm your host, Richard Bernard. Join us as we chat with Scott Frazer, author of Be Wise as Serpents. Scott is a chemist who joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at the age of 19 and served a mission a year later. Come listen as Scott talks about the importance of being wise like serpents, as quoted in Matthew 10:16. To be wise in our homes, defending our religious beliefs, and living in a day of emotion and reason are just a taste of the counsel found in the book. Scott touches on subjects that are important to all of us and does it in a very readable, concise, and enjoyable manner. Now, here's Scott. Scott, welcome to Cedar Fort. How are you doing this morning?
I'm great, thank you. Appreciate the time you spent for this interview.
Well, what no one knows, because they won't know unless I mention it here, this is our second try. We had some serious technical problems yesterday it was, and we just we could see each other and hearing each other, but you just weren't recording. And so anyway, we got it worked out, and we're ready to go. So you wrote a book. Why don't you tell us the title of it?
So the latest book is Be Wise as Serpents.
And why did you pick that title?
Well, this is from when the Savior is sending out his apostles on their missions, and he's giving them some very practical advice. He's probably a little worried about them, and so he wants them to be as gentle as doves, but as wise as serpents. So they're not to be naive. They need to understand that some men are going to be out there to harm them and to discredit them. And they just need to be not be gullible and to be wise about all their actions for their own safety, as well as for preaching the gospel.
Well, I've heard that phrase before, and I know where it's in the scriptures, and of course your book points it out, but I've always thought, is a serpent wise?
So yeah, because of the Garden of Eden, the serpent got a bad rap.
Yeah.
But yes, a serpent is known as for not being gullible, for being very wise of the ways of the world, because he has to be, because men try to kill snakes as they see them, whether they're poisonous or not. And so the snake has had to basically has the reputation for being very cautious and very wise about the fact that men can harm them. And so I think this is the metaphor, simile that the Lord was going for.
Well, he also uses the snake with Moses, that the brazen snake on the top of the pole. And I've had people in Sunday school classes, when that comes up, going, why was a snake used? And so,
and I don't know exactly why that would have been.
Yeah, but it's interesting. So it's been brought up many times. Now, I'm looking at your book, and I've had the opportunity to read it. It's really a great book, and I see that you've got this into three parts. Part one is Wisdom of the Serpent. Second part is in defense of church doctrine, and then part three is future needs for a serpent's wisdom. But let's talk about you just for 1 minute. You've written more than one book. What other books have you written?
So I've written three other nonfiction books. I have my doctorate in chemistry, and I'm also a convert to the church, which probably describes a lot of why I enjoy writing. I've always been interested in the overlap between science and religion. I think that the most defensible model for the creation of the universe and the earth is a combination between what we know from the Bible and what we know from science. So my first book is Where Science Meets God, 12 Ways Science Reinforces LDS Doctrine. And in going to church and such and discussing with other members of the ward, they tend to think that science and religion are opposed to one another. And they're not. They actually agree and concur in a number of different ways. And I wanted to write a book about that. And so that's my first book, Where Science Meets God. The second one is Angry with God. This book I wrote because I talked to a number of members and ex-members and inactive members who were really angry with God. Something had happened in their lives, and they didn't think that God was watching out for them. And so they were actually angry with him. They left the church. They became atheists or agnostics. And I wanted to write a book about, the subtitle is Understanding the Rules of Earth Life, because God has to obey the rules that he established in the creation. This has to be a world of faith. So therefore we can't have angels walking around outside, or because we have to be faithful because of our faith and not because we want a reward at the end of everything. And then the third book, Mentally Calm, Spiritually Connected. I wrote that because a number of my friends were going through depressions, and they were angry. They felt that God wasn't answering their prayers. He wasn't there for them at their greatest need. And I wanted to address that because a lot of people seem to have believed that. So that was my third book.
Well, I'm looking at chapter 2 here in your new book. It says the wisdom of the serpent inside our homes. What can you tell us about that?
So the fact of the matter is, even though we'd love to throw up, a brick wall and certainly a firewall around our homes, neither is going to be very practical. A lot of stuff that comes in the internet is very worthwhile and useful, and some of it is harmful and degrading. And the critics of the church have this brand new medium for attacking the church. They can come out with whether it be a website or a blog or something of that nature. And so our youth and ourselves can be exposed to misinformation that we normally would not even come across. So the idea behind this chapter was to point out the fact that our children are going to be exposed to this. Our youth are going to be exposed to this misinformation. And more than ever, we need to have information and answers ready to be able to answer their questions when they come up. We can't be as naive a people as we have been in the past, because the adversary is bringing the battle into our homes through social media and such. And so that was the idea behind this title, or this chapter, that we need to know that we can't isolate our children from the internet, but we can prepare them. We can give them the answers to the questions that are out there, because those questions never really change. They're almost always the same. And if our youth are forewarned and is explained to them exactly what this means, and then it's kind of like, okay, that old attack, we've heard that before. And that's what we want our youth to be ready and able to do.
That reminds me, my wife and I were having a discussion the other day, and we were talking about how things are going to get worse. And she admitted, she says, I'm such a naive person. I want to trust everybody and everybody's good. But she says, I've learned that maybe I need to start not being so naive.
Absolutely. So some of these podcasts, so I did a podcast for a little while. And in my research of looking at podcasts, I noticed some that is like, oh, they had these very innocuous titles, very simple, and sound like, well, this would be an interesting podcast to listen to. And so I turned to it and find out it was completely anti-Mormon. It was completely anti-church. And so I think that these podcasters put these titles to draw in members so that they just listen to them for a few minutes. And so, yeah, and I wouldn't have even thought of that as I clicked on the podcast link, that this may be against the church, because it doesn't sound like it's against the church. And so, yes, I, like your wife, have been very naive about a number of things in my church life.
I had a podcast I ran across several weeks ago, and exactly the same thing you were talking about right now. it sounded like, wow, this is an interesting podcast. And I listened to it just for a few minutes and I go, oh my gosh. Because this was a podcast by a woman who's, and she admitted she's dealt with depression and various things. And she just wants to know that she's loved, but she has to live life her way. So she doesn't want to be told she has to wear her garments every day. And it's these things. And what I found interesting was the people who were going, yes, yes, I identify with you. So there are these podcasts out there. Well, you've got another one. Well, I love your titles.
Thank you.
Chapter 5 is Living in a Day of Emotion Over Reason. My gosh, that is so true.
Yeah.
Share a few thoughts about that.
So, yes, whether you're looking at our media today, social media especially, everything's geared around emotions and how do you feel about this? And you know, the idea that that something can be true, not objectively, but subjectively. We can just believe it's true, and therefore it's true. And I have my truth, and you have your truth. And when you get into these discussions and people just react to you emotionally, well, emotionally usually means rather illogically, unreasonably. They really haven't thought it through in their head as to what they're actually saying. And so this is especially difficult for the gospel, because in the gospel, we believe in objective truth, that a truth is a truth and has always been the truth and will forever be the truth. But a lot of people are turning their nose up at that concept. And so whether we're talking about a particular doctrine, and that's what a lot of these podcasts try to do, they try to rile everybody up emotionally. If you actually had somebody there who could respond and answer their questions and turn it around and say, well, what are you actually saying? They couldn't respond, but they can rile people up emotionally. And so for people who listen to these podcasts or read these blogs, please understand that the person that's doing the blog or who's the podcaster, they're trying to get you riled up emotionally, because if they can get you riled up emotionally, then they can start giving you reasons to leave the church and not go on Sunday. And that's a problem, and it's becoming the norm rather than the exception. That media is trying to get everybody riled up and angry, and therefore angry with God, angry with the church, angry with church leaders. And when really, if these people would sit down and understand that, logically, reasonably thinking, this isn't as much of an issue as you're making of it, for example. So yes, we live in a difficult age, especially to have good gospel discussions, because everybody takes on the emotional, and they don't sit down and think about it, think about the reasoning behind it, and the fact that it makes sense, and it's comforting to know that, to have the truth before you. So yeah, it's a difficult time. It's a difficult time for missionaries, and for dealing with family and keeping everybody active in the church. It's a tough time. And that's kind of what the book was about.
I'm seeing, discussing with my wife again, and also one of my sons, there's a divide going on in the church. I see it happening. And I don't know if it started with COVID or not. Probably, I think it did. But there's just a widening. You'll have to forgive me, but I think it's in your book. You have a chart about the Millennials and Generation X. Okay, yes. It is your book. I read a lot of books. and I shared that chart about the Millennials and Generation X with my son, that how many don't believe in Jesus Christ. And these are members of the church.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So I was really blown away with those numbers, and so we have this divide that's happening, and I think it's widening.
And part of it is aligned along generations, it seems. Okay, so baby boomers like you and I are very still faithful in the church in high numbers, but millennials especially began questioning everything, not just religion, but all the rules and society, and started rebelling against it for whatever purpose. And then the Z generation, which is the our youth of today, uh, all these generations have different names given
Yeah.
to them, but
I can't keep them straight.
I can't either. Um, but the Z generation is reacting. They're following the millennials path that they've set out, and so they're more rebellious, more emotional. A lot of people blame this on social media, cell phones, and the fact that the kids have been doing this since they were, 10 years old, getting on social media on their phones, and everything revolves around emotion. Because you can't have, like, I don't know what the limits are now for a particular text or um, others, but you can't have a gospel discussion via text. It takes a little bit, it's a little more complicated than that. You have to be willing to sit down and discuss uh, topics,
Right.
gospel topics that have been around for millennia. And but the latest two generations are adverse to doing that. They want it quick, easy, fast, and be able to read it within a 30-second time frame. And so gospel discussion, that's tough to do that. So.
Yeah. In fact, they say things like the church should have told me, which you have a chapter on.
Oh, yes. That is in fact, I have a daughter who has left the church. And that was basically her and her husband. Her husband was a returned missionary, the whole thing. And they came for a visit. They live in California now, but they came for a visit. And that was their main complaint. The church should have told me about the history of the church, about Joseph Smith, and about the translation of the Book of Mormon. I was like, we did teach you those things. I was part of that teaching, and we've been teaching you that. But that is a lot of the younger generations that are leaving the church are using that as their reasoning, is the church should have told me that, and then you can fill in the blank from there. So yeah, there's a whole chapter dedicated to that because it's kind of an emotional topic for me. So.
And your second part, in defense of church doctrine, one of your chapters is responding to emotion-based criticism. So in your first section, you talk about how everything's based upon emotion. And then in the second part, you're kind of saying, well, this is how we can deal with it.
Well, a lot of the attacks. So the second part two is kind of a primer on how to deal with people that are attacking the church, whether it be a podcaster or your daughter. And there is a way to approach those answers. And one of the first things you have to do is to quell the emotion a little bit and say, so let's think about this rationally. And that's a tough place to get to because there's so much argument today that is emotional and not reasonable that's where people go. It's like, no, I'm angry about this, and therefore something's wrong because I'm angry about it. And so what I try to do is I took the basic attacks on the church and the gospel topics essays. The church kind of tried to do that too in the gospel topics essays. And I use the gospel topics essays in that chapter too as well, because the church looked at the main criticisms that they were receiving. I don't know what it's been, 10 or 15 years ago, and responded to them. And some of those responses are very good. And so I use some of that logic in part two there to explain away, not explain away, but to explain these attacks, what the answers are, and how you might consider making your argument when you're trying to explain to somebody about the church and church doctrine and what actually happened.
What I like about your book, you've got 26 chapters, over 156 pages, but no one chapter is really long. I mean, literally I'm looking at this as a book that you don't necessarily have to go from page 1 to page 156 or 160. It's a book that you could just open up just about any chapter and get the information you need.
And I hope readers will do that. That's why I try to be very explicit in the table of contents, because I wanted people to be able to, if there's, especially those things that bug you. Who was it? that basically said sometimes there's issues about the church that you put on a shelf, and then you go back and you visit that later on. And so, and I understand that there have been issues that I've about the church and church history and such that I've put on a shelf, and it took me years to come to a full understanding of it. This book is hopefully one of those resources that people can use if they're having a question, or if their child is asking them a question, that they can look for the right chapter and turn right to it. And yeah, because each chapter is a different response to different attacks and criticisms of the church.
The first chapter in that part 3 is a balance between dove and serpent, which you mentioned at the very beginning when we talked. And so to end here, what advice would you give people about being a dove and a serpent?
So being a dove is pretty easy. Okay. We understand that we're supposed to be compassionate and nice, and the Lord obviously wants us to do that. He wants us to be a dove. But at the same time, we have to be defenders of our home, for example. If there is an influence that's coming into our home, and everybody's telling you that, well, we need to be doves, we need to be nice, but there's a point where you say, no, I need to defend my home. I need to tell my children that maybe that person's not the person that we want them to be with or hanging around with. Or this website, you can't look at that anymore, or text this person. And so there is a balance, and the Lord's always intended there be a balance between the dove and the serpent. And so we need to be doves. We need to love our fellow man and that, but we also need to defend our own testimony. So I've been challenged on my testimony a number of times, and what goes through my head immediately is, okay, how do I respond to this? And sometimes it's like, this person's never going to affect my life again. And so I can give them a quick response. Others, it's, what, we're working together and I want you to understand this. And so I've explained it to people that I've worked with and or interacted with. And so we have to be willing to do that as parents. And also we have to be willing to defend our own testimony. A lot of times we forget about that. We just are concerned about others. We don't think about our own testimony. And so if we're having an issue, we need to go do some research and figure out what the answers are. And we need to be a serpent when it comes to our testimony, when it comes to be our loved ones' testimonies. And we need to be able to look at it, and we need to have the courage to go out and make those statements and to defend our homes and to defend our faith. And so that's what I'm hoping people do, is they balance the serpent and the dove. But they remember, especially in today's world, we need to be wise as serpents. Okay. Our society is forcing us to be, to not be gullible, to not be naive, to not allow these attacks to enter our homes. And so I'm hoping that members will see it, this book as that kind of a resource for them.
Where is your book available?
Amazon, of course. Deseret has not picked it up yet. I was very disappointed. I haven't done that. So yeah, Amazon would probably be the best and easiest for most people.
And of course, the Cedar Fort website.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah.
The Cedar Fort website is another place where you could get this book, or any of the other 3 either, for that matter. They're still available. So.
Well, thank you for your time. I found the book very interesting, and I told you I'm looking at all my highlights here that I made in the book. And I think it's a great book to be able to help all of us who are members of the church, either those that are trying to answer questions for others or those that just have questions. It's a great book to be able to help people. Can I say this? Get back on the path? So,
yes.
Okay. So I think it's a great book in that sense. Well, thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great day.
Okay. Thank you very much, Elder Bernard. I appreciate the phone call.
Scott Frazer's books are at cedarfort.com and, of course, on Amazon. Your support means the world to us, and if you enjoyed this podcast, please take a moment to give it a thumbs up and share your uplifting comments. By doing so, you'll help others discover this podcast and join our growing community of listeners. Lastly, don't forget to explore the other podcast I host, The Busy Latter-day Saint. In each episode, I have the privilege of interviewing incredible members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from all around the world who share their personal experiences and unique insights on Scripture study. The podcast is spiritually uplifting and a treasure trove of different approaches to studying the Scriptures.